Hey everyone, and welcome to the 58th episode of the Lee McCollum Show. All right, so I got a lot of good feedback from my episode with Mr. Deming, especially from people who were students of his, and I really enjoyed it. I would recommend going back and listening to that episode because Mr. Deming was my teacher back in high school. He was a public school teacher and he was also a libertarian, which was pretty awesome, and I'm very lucky for that. But I decided to bring him on since it's the 4th and talk about the Declaration of Independence, especially since he's the person who kind of taught me about the principles behind it. We actually just read through the Declaration and kind of analyze it, specifically the second paragraph, which is arguably the most important part, where it defines the principles that undergird the Constitution and should inform the Constitution, which is something that we try to get into, but as you'll see, the interview was actually cut off short. I'm not going to say that it was my assigned FBI agent or anything like that, but I did have some tech issues and I didn't catch the last thing we were going to talk about. That being said, we got pretty deep into some questions of rights, sovereignty, and the consent of the governed. And most importantly, we got into the conversation of whether or not we have a right of revolution, especially since Independence Day really is a celebration of seceding from Britain and revolting. I hope you enjoy this podcast. It was a very fun one to record, and definitely give me some feedback. And remember to subscribe to me on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, and Spotify. And here's Mr. Deming. All right, so I have Mr. Deming back with me. A lot of people enjoyed that episode. I had a few people retweeting it on Twitter, but yeah, I figured that I would bring Mr. Deming on and talk about the Declaration of Independence since July 4th is coming up. You have your Declaration of Independence with you. Why don't you just read and let's analyze it?
Okay, let's do that. So the money part, as far as I'm concerned, has always been the second paragraph, really, where it starts, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So I'd like to stop there and talk briefly about some of the points that if that's okay, if that's a good format for you.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there's so much just within the first little part right there too, even self-evident. If you just want to explain what you think is so important about we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. I think there's a lot just within that little part.
Sure is, and particularly when you understand who the author is, Thomas Jefferson, the slave owner. And so the self-evident part, I think, is just pretty easy to define as obvious. It's pretty obvious, I think. These truths are obvious, and they should be obvious to everybody, even though they aren't in the day. And one of the reasons why I thought this would be a pretty good thing to talk about, considering July 4th coming up, is that I don't think a lot of people really even know what the text of the Declaration says and how important it is. So what's your take on self-evident?
Well, I mean, I think that especially with understanding that Jefferson has read up on natural law and natural rights and stuff like that, I think that it would really have to do with the relationship between individuals and the dignity that I think a lot of the founders thought that we owed other people. And I think it's self-evident in the natural laws that they believed were attainable through reason.
Yeah, I think it's a good take, but I do think that it's not just evident within the natural law. It's evident, period. It's obvious to everybody, period. Without inside or outside of the natural law. And so I think it's universal in that regard. So all men are created equal. Did Jefferson mean all men? Did he mean to exclude women there? I mean, that's obviously an argument for our time today. I don't know. Did he?
Yeah. So I think that the way that men is spoken of in a lot of these texts is to encapsulate both men and women. They're obviously they will use his argument or him owning slaves to say that he couldn't have meant all men. But it's pretty clear in his writings about slavery, even at this time, I would say, that I think that him being familiar with these texts as well as biblical texts and just the conversations that he has, that it's pretty clear that he thinks that all men have this, the imago Dei, right? Like they have the image of God or something like that. Um, when you read Jefferson, that seems to be pretty clear throughout.
Okay. And so men refers to humankind.
Yeah.
Okay. I think there's some merit in that, obviously. So can a person who believed that all humankind is equal hold slaves?
It's a very good question. And I mean, like a lot of people like to bring up his treatment of his slaves too.
Yeah.
Um, and
Yeah.
I personally don't know much about it, but I know that he got one of them pregnant, and there's a lot there. But when you read his writings, I don't know the exact quote, but he has something along the lines of saying, "If there is a God," um, if I think you know the quote that I'm talking about.
Yeah. So it's an interesting quote. He says, paraphrased, I fear that God is a just God. He's also, because if God is just, Jefferson's in big trouble.
Yeah.
And I think he would be. Now, my understanding, and I used to compare Washington and Jefferson in class all the time, that Jefferson believed, and again, this is my understanding, Jefferson believed that his slaves couldn't manage on their own, and that he was doing them a favor by keeping them in slavery because he didn't think they could operate outside of his benevolence. And so he did not free his slaves uh, on his death in his will. Whereas George Washington believed the same thing, but in order to keep the slaves from being a burden on his estate, freedom. So I think when people say, oh, George Washington freed some of his slaves or some of the slaves in his will, if you look deeper at it, you'll see that that wasn't the best thing maybe for him to do, considering how he felt about them.
Yeah.
So anyway, Jefferson also said something about slavery's like having a tiger by the tail. You kind of want to let him go, but you can't. Something else I think is missed about Jefferson and slavery is that he worked pretty hard in the Virginia legislature to emancipate slaves, and realized that the time wasn't right, that he would never do that, never be able to do that, and so get that passed. And so he gave up. Now, I'm an admirer of Jefferson, so I've got some bias there, but I think you can see that he wasn't the completely evil slave holder that most people today consider him. So anyway, that's that.
I'm wondering any other quotes. I know that we were talking about it, and there was kind of this discussion of whether or not they could have freed them from the start of the country. And the idea was that they couldn't have united everyone if they did.
Right. So I think the question is, I think there were some folks who thought slavery was evil even in those days and wanted to get rid of slavery. And anyone who believed that knew that there was no way that they would have brought the southern states into the Union. Now, I think the argument can be made that maybe the moral thing would have been to form a union without those slave owning states, if in fact it was that big of an issue for you. But since keeping those folks in the convention and eventually ratifying the Constitution, uniting the country, that that's what they decided to do finally. So
Yeah, that
unity was more important than getting rid of slavery.
yeah, or union. Yeah, that's very interesting when kind of taken in parallel with conversations about the Civil War, I think too,
Mhm.
and what
Yes.
was priority there, because I mean it's the same idea. I think that there were even conversations. I know a lot of abolitionists were talking about seceding from the North, or I mean from the South, because they were slave owners. And I know that I think it was William Lloyd Garrison and Lysander Spooner. There were a few of them who advocated that. So it's very interesting just looking at those parallels there.
Yeah, it is. It's the same argument: unity or slavery. And would the northern states, non-slave holding slave states, would they have given up unity in either case for slavery? On balance, they decided. I don't think they decided in either case, either in the Revolution, the Constitution, or in the Civil War, that slavery was the most important thing until Lincoln made that that the goal in middle of the war. So I think there's a lot of people outside of Lincoln's circle that would have just allowed the South to go. It just wasn't worth it to them. And in fact, those people are called bitter enders, I think. So anyway, that's kind of off track, but
Yeah.
Sure. So we've gotten the first line in. I don't know if we've completely finished there. So
I really enjoy the next part if you want to read it.
Sure. All men are created equal. They're endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. And among those are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Yeah, that's there's a lot there too.
Yeah. So my question is, who do you take to be? Are they referencing the Christian God there?
Yes, they are. Even though much has been made that Jefferson and a lot of the founders were deists, and but yeah, Christian God, and I don't think that was by accident. Virtually every word in here was parsed by the committee headed by Jefferson that wrote this, and so they left that in there for sure. And I think that one of the reasons why is so that you can get a non-parliamentary or legislative source for rights. So if you can get your rights from God, and that those are unalienable rights, then no parliament, no legislature, no power on earth can take them from you. And I think that was done deliberately. Obviously, that they're endowed by their creator.
Yeah.
So for sure. Now, again, excuse me. So I think that Jefferson was also brilliant in this, that, and whether it was his idea or not, I don't know. But look at it. It just doesn't say God, right? It doesn't say that. It says their creator. So whoever their creator is gave them that. So if it left room, whether this was deliberate, like I said, is a different question. But it left room for different understandings of God. So.
Yeah, that is very smart. And out of that though, what you just mentioned about like the inalienable rights, comes so many conversations, like especially and most importantly probably is the distinction between negative and positive rights, I think. And whether or not the absence of the parliamentary process of rights allows positive rights, or if that is the source of positive rights, I guess. And if these rights come from your creator, whether or not you would have the right to another person's property, which I think, in essence, positive rights suggest.
Right. So it depends on your definition of positive rights. really. Negative rights. It depends on how you define those. So I'm not sure personally there are any positive rights. I think rights are things that prevent government from doing something bad to you, like stealing your property, or spying on you. So while today we are inundated with the idea of positive rights, I'm not sure there any of those exist. So unalienable rights, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. So I think those are negative rights in the sense that the government is prevented from interfering with life, liberty, or your pursuit of happiness.
And I think what's interesting about it is that those things in themselves, and like also when you look at the original text, what Jefferson originally considered, which was a quote by Locke, which was life, liberty, and property. So those things and pursuit of happiness included just set up necessary constraints on actions, and there's certain barriers, and that defines freedom. There's this question of whether or not you can have the freedom to enslave somebody. Like if you're talking about how you're a lover of freedom or liberty, one of the main objections you might get is, well, do you have the freedom to do X? And it's typically a freedom to, infringe someone else's rights. And inherent in this definition that's laid out of freedom is the idea that that wouldn't be freedom. Like, no, you don't have the freedom to infringe someone else's rights because the constraints of freedom are defined here. And once you do that, you're no longer within the realm of it.
Right. Yes, exactly right. And it's brilliant in that as well. And I think that's something that's missed. So people's right today to healthcare depends on the government taking money from me without my consent. Yeah. That's a perfect example of the importance we placed on positive rights today that I don't think exists or should exist.
Yeah, it's interesting.
I mean, if your rights are inalienable, and you have the right to life and liberty, pursuit of happiness. So how can someone else's rights supersede mine to those things? So, yeah. Anyway,
there is another conversation about where pursuit of happiness comes from, and it's interesting. I think it actually comes from Locke, and they capitalize happiness. And Locke's conception of happiness was an infinite kind. It was of the highest kind, which I find interesting. So it's not just like this Epicurean idea, but also he was pretty clear in his conception that no one could define what happiness was for another person. So in this part right here, there's just so much philosophy behind all of this. But yeah, if you want to keep reading, that would be awesome.
Okay, so that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So I want to finish because I think that's that sentence, because I think that's the important part. Okay, so a lot of people stop right there. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, is the right of the people to alter or abolish it and institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. So it's beautiful, really. It's elegant. So that to secure these rights of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that's why governments are instituted. That's it. It's not to make sure you have enough food, or it's not to make sure that you have universal basic income or anything else. It's there. government's there to secure life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for each individual.
Yeah, it's also interesting. We get a concept of sovereignty here. The idea that sovereignty doesn't come like it's like not a divine right that an individual or a king possesses, but that governments are instituted among men, derived deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. So it's like we get this concept of subsidiarity right there,
Mm-hmm.
where
For sure.
the men and men is capitalized right there. Interestingly, um, that is where government derives its powers. So we get this concept that individuals possess this sovereignty, and sovereignty moves upward from there.
Right. So we've had quite a few discussions about consent over the years, haven't we?
Yes.
So uh, I love the Lysander Spooner, and I refer to him all the time. And he said he never he never consented to any of it. And so, can we be held liable for a document that you and I never consented to? And the answer is no. So one of the points I like to bring up when we talk about this part is that Jefferson believed that one generation should not impose its ruling documents on the next. And so I think he had a formula, 19 or 20 years, and they had to turn that over. They had to revisit the Constitution. I think it's a great idea in a lot of ways. Now, I don't know if you knew this, but Montana's Constitution, rewritten in 1972, has a provision so that the people can vote and must vote every 20 years, whether or not to continue the old Constitution or to rewrite it.
Yeah. But it's interesting though, the conversation about whether or not that's expressed enough for Lysander Spooner, because it's still you haven't consented to that system. But
Right.
I think what's important here is that we know that Thomas Jefferson read a lot of Locke, and this was inspired by Locke, and we get the flaws of his thinking here. Because the conversation about whether or not you needed consent came up, but his consent is a very weak kind. He said it was either tacit. So the different kinds are tacit, expressed, or I think it's imputed, and that's Rousseau, I believe. So Rousseau believed that it was inherent to you, that just based off of our relationship and based off of our nature, we've consented, which is terrifying to me, and I can just disregard that. But the idea of whether or not you tacitly consent by using roads, for instance, that is how Locke justified this consent of the governed. So if you use public property, if you use any of these things, or what is called public property, you have consented to that system. Where Lysander Spooner would say that that doesn't go far enough, because nowhere else in society do you do this.
Another reason I like Spooner.
Yeah, you always sign a contract.
Right.
But
You
yeah,
always do.
but do you have another anything else on that point?
No. I think we better move on to the incendiary parts.
All right, and probably relevant parts for everyone.
Today, for sure, this weekend.
Yeah. And looking back at 2020, considering how certain people acted that might not actually agree with what we're reading right now. So yeah, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundations on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. So what are your thoughts there?
So getting ready for the national competition, I always caution the kids, you better be careful what you say. You may believe in the right of revolution, but if you say the word revolution, the judges are going to discount you as not being a serious person. But would they, if Jefferson was in front of them, would they question Thomas Jefferson's view that the right of revolution is an inalienable right? He makes it pretty clear there. He says it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. And look at the context that he uses. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, which is to secure the rights of life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. Period. Yeah, so it would have been fun to see Thomas Jefferson sit in front of those nationalist judges, especially some of the smug ones, and say, we're in the middle of a revolution right now, throwing off an unjust government, the shackles of this unjust government. We're doing it by force. What do you say to that?
Yeah. Well,
And
it's interesting because the question of what that threshold is came up a lot in the competitions, and I would always ask
right.
this, what is that threshold? And he actually expresses it right here. And you share, or you've told me about this before, what you think the threshold is. So do you want to explain your thoughts? I don't know if you want to commit, but
yeah, I'm actually kind of eager to do that.
Yeah.
So pretty clearly, and this is what a lot of people miss. I think a lot of people, even scholars, miss, maybe they do that deliberately too, but they miss this point that whenever any form of government, not just our government, any form of government becomes destructive of the ends of preserving life, liberty, and property, is the right of the people to alter and abolish it. So the second your government begins to work against those rights to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, that's the trigger, period. It can't be any other way. So if it's any other way, then we don't really believe in the principles that Jefferson laid out in this declaration. And if we don't believe in the principles that Jefferson laid out in the Declaration, then anything goes. Right? So we have a government today that thinks that it can, and apparently it can, lock us down for 18 months, make us wear face coverings that everybody knows don't do anything. And now they're thinking about COVID passports, and they're thinking about forcing you to take an experimental injection. If that isn't a violation of those rights, I don't know what is. Right? So we've long passed the trigger, in my opinion.
Yeah,
long past.
It's interesting here how the idea that, let me see, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. So here we get kind of just a little thread of the idea of consent here again, and that it comes from the people. And it's interesting in our conversations about express consent and libertarianism and all of these ideas, it seems that there's an element of the voluntary nature in here too, where they would be able to associate with whatever you think, because it says shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness, that these people have liberty to associate with whatever system they think will best do that.
To associate and create, if need be, a system that will work in their favor, where before. So imagine where they were at that time in 1776. Imagine where they were. I think it can be argued that the founders, weren't as pressured by bad government as we are. I think they had less to complain about than we do.
That's right. And I don't think we'll get there, but people can actually read at the end of the Declaration all of the complaints they had. So there's another part of the text that's coming up that I know you're very interested in, and I think it has a little to do with what the nature of a revolution would look like, and it might not really flesh it out as much, but when the text says, prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. Do you think that we should always resort to other efforts first, like decentralization and nullification efforts? And if those nullification efforts are working, like in Montana, where we become a sanctuary gun state or, you know, a marijuana state and all of these things, and we have shown that these powers are they're proving to work, do you think that revolution in another sense should be still in our cards?
Do you mean, well, okay, let me answer it this way. So I think the absolute best way is, to fight a government that's completely out of control, as I think ours is getting worse and exponentially worse by the month, is nullification. It's the only way. It's the only merciful way, because if the states will stand up to the national government as they are, and I'm dang proud of them, especially Montana for that, then there's no need for force of arms. And it would have to get pretty awful for people today to take up arms against the government. But our ancestors did.
Yeah.
George Washington took up arms against his government. That was treason. And had they lost, I doubt that the leaders of the revolution would have survived. Pretty sure they've been hanged. And so I do think that, we celebrate July 4th as our Independence Day. But in fact, it was in the middle of a bloody war to free ourselves from an oppressive government, which only about maybe about 2/3 of the country agreed with. There are a lot of loyalists still in the American colonies. So anyway, I think unfortunately, there may have to be in the future a time for that.
Yeah.
I know that's heresy, but what's the alternative? The alternative is slavery, and I'm not going to live a slave. So,
yeah, and I think that people really do have to ask themselves whether or not they think that the revolution was justified, like our revolution that we celebrate, if they start to ask that question. And I mean, one of my professors, surprisingly, I had a really great professor this last year, ask that same question. He's like, we're reading about all of these revolutions in this class, but have you ever thought about ours? Because you celebrate it, but when you talk about these other ones, what do you think? So I mean, I think that those are legitimate questions. But I think that it's kind of like a reverse subsidiarity thing, where like the test must be if your state isn't doing it, if your locality isn't doing it, like if they aren't safeguarding the individual in some sense, then the responsibility lays on the individual then. So if the national government is oppressing you, and the state isn't kicking back, I think that that's the test there. And right now, luckily, we are in a situation where the state is doing exactly where it needs to, exactly what to do.
But well, just imagine living in some of the lockdown states, or some of the states that are frankly crazy. I mean, California, they're absolutely crazy. Oregon, Portland, Oregon is, as I understand it, a nightmare. Imagine living there and having the views that you and I have. That there's no way that I could live in that environment. And so what's your option?
Yeah.
Your only option there, considering the fact that you're going to be outnumbered, is to leave. And, in our country, I'm not willing to leave. I mean, things would have to get pretty bad. I'd move around the country if I had to, to find freedom, but I wouldn't want to leave. But if that was an option, if it came to that, I would. I think a lot of people would too.
Yeah.
So the very last resort would be to take up arms.
And right there was a perfect argument for decentralization. Whereas if there is a one size fits all solution across the entire country, then you really don't have much options. Like these people who say, oh, well, if you don't like this country, just leave. I mean, that's not reasonable for a lot of people in the United States right now. But if the argument is if you don't like this city, leave, that makes a lot more sense.
It does make a lot more sense. And that's why I think the Declaration is so important. If our government is set up to protect our rights, and if we have philosophical permission to change the government if they refuse to do that, which we do through Thomas Jefferson's words here, then that's really the option. That's what we have to do. Saying just leave if these rights are being taken away, it violates the philosophy that Thomas Jefferson was advocating.
Yeah. Yeah. And just this entire conversation of what constitutes a revolution, like I think that here we really do get the idea that Ron Paul kind of argued for, that there can be a revolution through ideas and there can be a revolution through nullification. And we know that the presidency was considered, a peaceful revolution, though probably not as peaceful considering how much power it has. But it's just the idea that really ideas and all these other options, I think, should be considered in what Jefferson is saying right now. But there's one more part that I think you wanted to get to that is pretty important. If you want to read it, because it's pretty powerful, just talking about the constraints and the threshold.
Right. So prudence indeed, Jefferson's words, prudence indeed will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light and transient causes. And accordingly, all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer, while evils are sufferable, than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they're accustomed. And so I think we've been taking it for a while. The people who love liberty have been saying, well, we'll work within the system, we'll get the right people, vote the right people in, we'll hope for the Supreme Court to save us, on and on and on. I think there will come an end point if the states don't step in, and take back some of the powers that have been either given up voluntarily, involuntarily. We talked about last time, what Montana has had to go through over the course of our history dealing with the federal government. I think people will take it. We'll take it for a while, but there's going to be an end point. After a while, after this, while evils are sufferable, when they become insufferable, then that will be the time.
Yeah, and there's a certain sense in which this is experienced on both the left and the right, or libertarians or independents, that we're seeing this conversation on the left as well, with the protests. There's a certain sect that says we don't want revolution at all, and that's almost like within the Overton window. Like, people say that on TV. They say no reform, abolition. Like, that's within the window for certain people. So it's very interesting that conversation is happening, and there are protests throughout the streets, and buildings being burned, and private buildings being burned. And then there's also the MAGA insurrectionists and how completely different that conversation was. And what I find interesting in a lot of the conversation was that it seems that, at least in the conversations people have around what protests are, and like these massive protests, is implied that there is a certain point at which that would be justified. And I don't think that people, at least those people who are saying that the insurrectionists were insurrectionists or whatever, are willing to discount that. I think that they still say that at a certain point there would be a point where that would be justified, or at least entering into a public facility and protesting, because that obviously they weren't doing anything other than just walking in and like putting their feet up on desks. Like that's, but still, I've always found interesting since that day that I haven't heard someone totally discount the fact that there might be a point at which this happens. And it's evident through our foreign policy. These people who were arguing it were saying, well, at the same time, they're advocating for toppling regimes because they understand, that in a certain sense, even though we might not like, the violation of their sovereignty in these foreign countries, that they at least understand there is a certain point where it's necessary. So that's something that I've been thinking about, just because, like Dave Smith always had this quote, like, what is a protest? What is the essence of a protest? Is it really just people are getting out there and, just gathering together, or is it that there's kind of a threat behind it? And certain people who might not like these conversations we're having like to protest a lot.
Right. So there's a lot there. Let me just, so I think going back to earlier point, there's an end point. People only take so much. And then what they decide to do after that, that's going to be up to obviously every individual. But the question is, do people have a right to change their government? Do they have the right to withdraw their consent? And the answer to that both those questions has to be yes. It has to be. Otherwise the system breaks down. And here's how it breaks down. If you can't, then what can't your government do to you? The answer is nothing. If you don't have recourse through what Thomas Jefferson was talking about, the right of revolution, if you don't have recourse, then the government can do anything they want to you. That's essentially the end point. And so I think nobody in their right mind would advocate that. Well, the government's not going to do anything bad to you. Oh yeah, ask those people who were kept from ivermectin and vitamin D and hydroxychloroquine. Tell those people. If in fact hundreds of thousands of people died of COVID, they could have been saved by these therapies, especially hydroxychloroquine. Then your government can in fact kill you, and you got no recourse. So we're kind of at an end point here, I think, in America today. And if people ever figure out that they have had these therapies hidden deliberately from them when people knew better, as far as I can see, that is cause. That's cause, right? So,
yeah, there was a study I saw even before COVID talking about the excess deaths that occur because of the FDA approval process, and just because the lack of access to certain cancer treatments because they're going through 10-year process, that the government doesn't think that you have the ability to consent to taking a drug that, I mean, like what's the risk? You're going to die. Like if you're already on your deathbed, why not? And luckily I think Trump did pass the right to try act, but I'm not sure where that's at right now.
Yeah, I don't either.
So, but yeah, I think everything you said right there is very true and important.
So something else I kind of wanted to bring up. the insanity of calling this January 6th an insurrection I think it's deliberate. I really do. I believe right to the ground that this is a way for the government to categorize people like me in domestic terrorists as domestic terrorists. And this conversation we're having here, I know would be a red flag for a lot of people in the government, because they believe that it's treason to fight for the rights that we are guaranteed both in the Declaration and the Constitution. Now, when those people can be called domestic terrorists, the government is completely out of control.
And they might themselves be domestic terrorists.
Yeah, absolutely. They are the domestic terrorists. In fact, I think the military is even getting, at least the reports are that they're getting stripped of people who are conservative, MAGA supporters, and they're trying to get rid of those people, or at least to indoctrinate them, into the right way of thinking. Well, I know that's deliberate. I mean, they've admitted it. They want to get rid of those extremists, the extremists that believe in the Constitution.
They actually released a new definition of what a domestic terrorist is, and it included things like keeping people captive, kidnapping them, coercing them, making them do something against their consent. And I'm paraphrasing, but I saw this picture that was highlighting, it was the White House website. All right, and that's where the recording just decides to shut off. You only miss about like 5 minutes of recording afterwards. So I might have Mr. Deming come back for a part 2 though. I'm not entirely sure, but he definitely will be back on the podcast. I hope you enjoyed this one. It was really fun for me. Remember to subscribe to me on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and Spotify, and come back next time. Thanks.